Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Behringer's webinar on business rules, JavaScript, workflows, and custom code. Today, we're going to talk about some standard functionality that you can use, as well as some custom functionality to fill in the gaps when the standard functionality doesn't work. Just a little bit about myself. My name's Christina Bailey. I work at Behringer Technology Group. I'm a Dynamics 365 implementation specialist. And just a few fun facts about myself. I have over 10 years of Microsoft CRM and Dynamics experience. I started on version 4.0, and I'm currently a D365 online user using version 9.1. My blog handle is Dynamics Diva. So if you go to our website, behringer.net, and access our blog, you can go to that URL directly. You can see my blogs under Dynamics Diva. I'm a Dynamics best practices guru, and one of my favorite Dynamics technology topics right now is AI. I'd really like to learn a lot more about that and get a lot more involved with some of the new functionality that's coming out. So today we're going to talk about business rules, JavaScript, workflows, custom code, some different real-life business scenarios of when to use each, and some of the best practices surrounding each of them, as well as just some general information about each of the components. So business rules were introduced in version 2013 and were able to be used to replace functionality that system administrators previously used JavaScript for. In version 2011, the concept of web resources was introduced as a way to share JavaScript libraries across forms. Background workflows have always been available, but in version 2013, the concept of real-time workflows was introduced. And custom code can be used and called from either type of workflow as a way to fill in the gaps when the out-of-the-box functionality just isn't enough. Okay, so just some real-life business scenarios that we're going to cover today. So I want to hide the billing address section if the account type is shipped to. When a new appointment is created on an account, I want to update the last appointment date on the account with the end date from the appointment. Another one, I actually have two requests that are both on the account form. I want to hide the map tab if address 1 doesn't contain data. I also want to add a pop-up alert based on the information from the alerts tab. And finally, if I enter an appointment from the past, or if I update the date on an existing appointment, it doesn't update the account with the last appointment date that I'm expecting. So just look at these real quick and see if you can match up which goes with which component. So we're going to go over business rules, workflows, JavaScript, and custom code. Okay. So let's talk about business rules. What are they? Business rules allow you to implement and maintain rules on main and quick create forms that are based on fields or business processes without the need to write JavaScript or develop custom plugins. Okay. Just some things about business rules. When you set up your business rule, you can pick your scope, and when your scope, you're going to see that you can pick the entity level, or you can pick a specific form, or you can pick all forms. So when you're setting up a business rule, you want to consider your scope. If you pick the entity scope, it is going to run server side. If you pick all forms or a specific form, then your business rule is only going to run client side. So if you have a business rule that is updating data in a field, and you do a lot of imports, or you have a data integration, then you probably want to run that business rule server side so that anytime you import data or run your integration, that the business rule applies to that data import. Fields used in business rules must be on the published form. So if you don't put the fields on the form, the whole entire business rule will break. Portal forms do not inherit business rules. So if you use Dynamics Portal at this time, those forms are not going to adopt the business rules that you set up. You can only add up to 9 conditions. You can use conditions of and or that are based on fields or the business processes. And unlike your workflows, you can't really nest, or your advanced finds, you can't really nest your and or statements. It's either all and or all or. And then these are just the available actions on the business rule. And one of the other things I just wanted to point out is that you can trigger a business rule on create of a record. So you would just add a condition saying, modified by does not contain data, or created on does not contain data. So that kind of mimics your created on that you used to be able to use the form type in JavaScript. But again, if you go that route, you have to make sure that the field you use in the condition is published on the form. Okay, so our scenario for business rule is I want to hide the billing address section if the account type is shipped to. So let's go ahead and do this. So here are all of my accounts. So if I go into an account, what we're looking to do is hide the billing address when the account type is shipped to. So if this is equal to ship to, I want to hide billing address. If it's bill to, I want to show billing address. Now, this isn't a required field. And if you noticed when I opened up the form, this was blank. So I'm going to need to account for that as well. So what I want to do is if the account type equals bill to, I want to show this section or show these fields. So one nice thing about business rules is if you hide all of the fields within a section, it will suppress the entire section for you. So you won't, if I hide these 4 fields, you're not going to see billing address. This is actually a section, so you won't see billing address. So I've already set up my business rule, but let's have a look at it. Okay. Just zoom out a little bit. So my condition, I'm saying if the account type is not equal to bill to, then I want to hide those 4 fields. Otherwise, I want to show those fields. Now, there was a couple different ways I could have written this. I could have said if account type is equal to bill to, then show the fields. Otherwise, hide the fields. So it would have had the same result. So over here on the right, you see the properties, and the properties are based on the element that I have selected, or the component I have selected. And one of our best practices is to actually name these blocks with a meaningful display name so that when someone comes in to look at this, they know exactly what this business rule is doing. Same with when you name them, you want to give it a meaningful name so that you have some sort of idea of what the business unit is doing. Let me just show you a few other shortcuts that you can do in here. You're able to copy these blocks. So when I set this up, I set up my first 4 blocks, and then all I simply did was copied and pasted those blocks, and then just changed a few things. I just changed hide to show, and then visibility to yes. So that way I don't have to recreate and go through all the fields and find the fields twice. I just have to find the field once and then copy that block and paste it. So when adding conditions, under here, if I go over here to components, I have my conditions and then my actions. These are all my available actions. So when adding conditions, you can only add nested conditions under the false condition. So you see when I drag this over, I only have the ability to put it here. I don't have the ability to put it up here. And you can only have 9 nested conditions in one business rule. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and activate this. Now, another best practice we like to follow is when you are hiding fields on a form, showing and hiding fields, that by default you want to hide those fields on the form to start with. So I didn't do that with this scenario because I wanted to show you that section on the form first, but normally I would hide those fields by default on the form. And that is in here under the account form. I would just come into these different field properties and uncheck visible by default. So that's just another best practice that we follow. All right, so let's have a look. Let me go into an account. We'll check out the Datum account. Okay, so this is a bill to account, so I'm able to see the billing address field. If I change this to ship to, notice how the entire section suppresses. So I don't see the heading anymore. So that's, again, that's one nice thing about business rules is that the entire section suppresses when you hide all of the fields within that section. Okay, so what did we learn? So one thing I didn't really talk about that much, but for some conditions, you usually need to consider the opposite and add actions for the false condition. So in our business rule, if we would have only had what to do when the condition was true, when the condition was false, it wouldn't know what to do. It wouldn't do anything. So that's why you always have to add, if you have all the conditions, if you have all the components to show a field, you have to have the opposite component to hide that field. The most common actions for business rules are field-based, and you can only add additional conditions to an existing condition when it's false. So I did show that. And just to outline some best practices, make sure you name your business rule accordingly. Update the display name for your condition to note what it is doing. Update the display name of your actions to note what they are doing. You want to set the scope only for what you need. So if you don't need a business rule to run server-side, then don't set the scope to the entity level, just set it to the form level. And if you only need it to run on a specific form, or if your users only use one form, then just set it to that specific form. And when setting the visibility, you would want to hide the field on the form by default. Okay, so the next thing we're going to cover is JavaScript. So JavaScript allows you to manipulate forms and data in real time. JavaScript libraries are assigned to a form through a web resource record in Dynamics. Once attached to the form, functions within the JavaScript can be called onLoad, onChange, and onSave. Okay, just some things about JavaScript. It only runs client-side. So unlike with the business rule, when you set the scope to entity, it'll run server-side. JavaScript is only going to run client-side, and it's only going to run on that form when the user is interacting with that form. You want to keep it simple. You want to avoid using unsupported code. Fields used in JavaScript must be on the published form. Same with the business rule. If you're going to reference a field through JavaScript, it has to be published on the form. You only want to use JavaScript when all other options are exhausted. You want to make sure you add comments to your code. You can add alerts for troubleshooting, and you can use try-catch to report errors. Okay. So the business scenario for JavaScript, I actually have two requests that are both on the account form. I want to hide the map tab if address 1 doesn't contain data. And I also want to add an alert based on the information from the alerts tab. So we talked about business rules. And the one nice thing about business rules, if you hide all of the fields in a section, that section will suppress on the form, but not with a tab. If you hide every field within a tab, the tab is still going to show up. It won't have any sections. If all the fields are hidden, it'll suppress all the sections, but the tab does not suppress. And also with business rules, you can't get to subgrids or other components other than fields. So why use it? So we just talked about the business rule can suppress the section by suppressing all the fields, but it can't suppress the tab. And you can't suppress subgrids or non-field components through a business rule. And as far as the alert that I'm going to show you, you could set up a warning on a field, but you can't set up an alert on the form. So one of the components that you could add with business rules, one of the actions you could add was to add a field alert. But in this case, we want to have a form alert. So when someone opens up a record, we want some sort of alert at the top based on data from a text field. Okay, so let's go back to accounts. Okay, into my solution, and let's look at web resources. And here's my JavaScript library. So let's look at this. So this is a web resource, and when you set up a web resource, you select the type. So there's a type of JScript, which is JavaScript. And I'm just going to click on text editor so we can look at the actual JavaScript. So one thing we do is we use verbose logs, and the variable is right here in the JavaScript library. So if I were to set this to true, everywhere in my code where it says verbose logs, it's going to alert me as it runs through the function. So this is just a way that we use to troubleshoot our JavaScript functions. So if something happens with this, maybe it's not loading correctly or it's not doing what I want it to do, I could just I could set this to true, publish it, and then whatever form that this library is attached to, when I open up that record in Dynamics, it would just alert me as it runs through the function. So these are just kind of some best practices. You want to make sure that you have some sort of logging set up, and you also want to make sure you have comments in your JavaScript. So if somebody has to come in and look at this, just add a few comments so that they know what this function is doing. So this is the function to hide our map tab. So we have our try catch, and if it fails, it gives me the actual message from the error. I'm just declaring a few variables here. I will talk about the execution context, which is new for version 9. You don't have to use the xrm.page anymore. You can now use execution context, which is very nice. It's a very easy way to access all the controls and attributes on a form. So I'm just setting a few variables, getting the street from address 1, line 1, and then I'm setting my Boolean variable here for street 1, if it's null or if it's blank. So that'll set it to true or false. And then same with alert text. I have my variables, and I have my verbose logs in here as well. Okay. So I'm going to go into my account form. Okay. So under form properties, up here you have all your JavaScript libraries. Now some of these are system libraries, but I had to add my library here, so you'll see new account.js and then account.js. And then down here is where you'll see the different functions that are called. So I had two functions in my library. I had hide map tab and I had alert text. Now right now they're disabled, but I'm just going to open these up. So I specify my library and I type in the function name and I say enabled and say okay. And these are being called on load of the form. And then same thing for alert text. I'm going to set that to enabled. So not only do I want to call these on load of the form, I also want to call them on change of the field. So if somebody opens up a new account or if they're typing in an address in a currently blank address line 1 field, I want that map tab to show up for them right away. I don't want to have them save the form and come back in just to see that map tab. So if I click on control, in here I have access to all of the elements that are on the form. So I can access any tabs, and yes, you can call JavaScript from the tab change between expanded and collapsed. And then I can also call a function on change of a field. So I want to look for street address. And these are in order of the way they appear on the form. So I know street address 1 is first, and address 1, street 1 is first, and address 2, street 1 is second. So if I just click on this, now I can access my on change events for that field. And again, it's already in here. I've already added it. I just disabled it. So now I'm just going to enable it and say okay. So that's one way you can access on change events. And I'll show you another way. So the other function I'm going to call on change of my alert message. So I have an alerts tab here, and I have a message field, which is my alert text. So if I just double click on this field and get into the field properties, I have a tab up here for events. I simply click on that. Again, I've already added the event. I've already added the on change event here. I just disabled it. So I'm going to open that up and enable it. Say okay. Say okay. And then I'm going to save and publish my changes. Okay. So let's go ahead and close this. And let's head back here. I'm just going to refresh to make sure. Okay, so let's just open up an account here. And we see an alert. So this account has an alert. So in case you didn't know, today is free coffee day at Wawa. And Fourth Coffee wanted all of its users to know, well, I'm sorry, all the users of the system, when they opened up the Fourth Coffee account, they wanted everyone to be alerted that Wawa is offering free coffee today. You'll also notice that I can see the map tab because there is a street address. So if I click on the map tab, it just, oops, disabled. It would show the map. But let's delete this and you'll see the map tab go away because I'm calling that event on change of the street address. So now I don't see the map tab anymore. And as far as my alerts, so all this is simply doing is taking the message I type in this box and adding it as an alert to the top of the form. And there is some logic in that JavaScript code that looks at the expiration date as well. So based on the expiration date, if the expiration date's passed, it's not going to show that alert anymore. So if I take this away and I take the date away, and if you remember, I have it triggering on change as well. And let's change our message to something else. Set our expiration date back to okay. So this is not working like it was last night. So let me just kind of go into one that I haven't added an alert to. Oh, I know why, because my JavaScript code is looking at my expiration date as well as the message to make sure this hasn't passed. So because this was blank before I added my message, the JavaScript wasn't working the way that I would expect. So it's probably something I would want to change. I may not necessarily, I may want to look at blank expiration date as well, or come up with some different functionality for a better end user experience. Because again, JavaScript should be used to enhance your end user experience. So let's save this. Let me go back into Alpine Ski House and I'll see that. Oops, it expired. See that? I meant to put the 13th. There we go. So it did trigger on change of the event and popped up my message at the top. Okay. So what do we learn? We learned JavaScript is added to Dynamics through a web resource. The JavaScript library is added to a form through the web resource, and functions from the JavaScript library can be called onLoad, onSave of the form, and can also be called onChange of fields and tabs. And just some best practices that we follow. You want to use JavaScript as a last resort. One of the things, the dynamic visibility of a tab can only be controlled through JavaScript. So, if you want to hide a tab, you just have to use JavaScript for that. You want to use that execution context concept. So let me head over to, let me show you this website real quick. So this talks about how to use the execution context, and then in here you have all of your attributes and all of the, the get name. So these are all the elements you can use in your JavaScript for the fields. So all the get attribute and then the get control. So these are all the controls that you can use. And then there's some form context. So this is nice. It's a huge time saver. It's a lot better than the xrm.page. If you've used Dynamics for a while, you remember that xrm.page used to be crm.page. So this is actually, it keeps getting better. So this is a lot nicer to use. You want to use your try catch. You want to use comments. If you have someone else supporting the system and maybe they don't understand JavaScript, then you really can't comment enough. Like you can't put enough comments in there to help someone understand what your JavaScript function is trying to do. And then also use that verbose logging. And again, you only want to use JavaScript to enhance the user's experience. You don't want to use it to populate data. And the one reason that we highly recommend that, to not use it to populate data, is it only runs on the form and it only runs client side. So if you're importing data and you're dependent on, JavaScript updating data in a field based on another field, then that's not going to happen during a data import or data integration. Okay, the next topic is workflows. So what are they? Workflows are a type of process. They are triggered by a defined event that occurs in the system. Once triggered, a series of conditions and steps are called to perform some type of action. Just some facts about workflows. Background processes will run asynchronously, while real-time workflows will run synchronously. You must trigger the workflow from the entity you select the workflow to run against. In addition to triggering a workflow, you can also run a workflow on demand or as a child workflow from another workflow. Dynamics does come with some pre-configured workflows, and the scope of your workflow is based on the workflow owner in conjunction with the user triggering the workflow. So let's look at our business scenario. When a new appointment is created on an account, I want to update the last appointment date on the account with the end date from the appointment. Okay. So let me look in my solution here, and I have my processes component, and I have, here's my workflow. So update last appointment date on account from the start date from the appointment. I think that said end date, but start date, end date, from the date on the appointment. So let me just deactivate this so we can look at it. So again, one of our best practices when we write workflows, we make sure that we put meaningful text in each step, so that if a user is on a record and they go into background processes and something failed, they can follow through the steps and maybe see why the workflow failed. But I have my condition. So my condition is if the appointment start time contains data and the appointment is regarding the account. So because an activity in Dynamics can be regarding to almost any other record, you want to make sure that you check that. You want to make sure that the record type is an account. So in here I have regarding account, and then account contains data. Otherwise, when you try to do your update step and update the account, it would fail if the regarding was blank or was a contact or anything else. You're going to end up with a failed workflow. And then under update, I just set my properties. And then here I have my last appointment date, and I'm just pulling the start time from the appointment to populate that field. So just some other things I want to point out on here. You can run this as an on-demand process. You can run it as a child process. I would recommend always deleting your completed workflow jobs unless you have a reason to save them. Maybe you're troubleshooting something. You can uncheck this, but just remember to come back in and check it off again, because these will pile up in your system jobs if you leave this unchecked. Your scope. So you have different scopes. You have a user scope, business unit, parent-child business unit, and organization. So when you create a new workflow, it defaults to user. So what this means is that the owner of the workflow must be the person triggering the action on the record. So if I leave this set to scope of user and I publish this and it's the perfect workflow and I want everybody to be able to use this workflow, that's not going to happen. So if I leave this as user and I activate this workflow, it's only going to run for records that I create or that I update with whatever field changes in here. So there might be certain circumstances where you want to create a workflow simply for yourself, and in that case you would want to leave the scope as user. But if you are creating a workflow that you want everybody in your system to use, or that you want to have triggered no matter who performs the action, then you always want to make sure you change this to organization. If you do have business units set up, different hierarchy of business units, and maybe you just need to run this for a specific business unit, then again, just select business unit, and as long as the user is in the same business unit as the owner of the workflow, then it will run for them. If they're not in that same business unit, then it won't run for them. So I'm triggering this when a record's created. There's some other triggers you can do when records assigned, status changes, if the record's deleted. And then I'm also triggering it when a field changes. So because this is running on the appointment entity, I can only trigger it on change of fields from the appointment entity. I can't access fields from any other entity. And then down here is where we just add our steps. We already talked about the condition and updating account. But just to show you, there are some other steps that you can add. So you have your check condition, conditional branch, default action, and these are selected because I actually have that condition highlighted. So if I click off of that or select the whole thing, now I have other options available. So I can add wait conditions, I can add a parallel wait condition if I'm kind of the same with the check conditions, depends on what I'm selecting in my steps. So I wouldn't be able to add a parallel wait condition until after I added a wait condition. And then I have other options here. So I could create a record, I can update a record, I can assign a record, I can send an email from the workflow, I could start a child workflow, I could perform some sort of action, change the status of a record, or stop the workflow. So just to show you the actions, I'm just going to pop this in here real quick. So there are, this was introduced a few versions ago, and this actually has come in very handy. So they exposed some of the actions through workflows to give you the ability to perform some things that you couldn't perform before, like closing a case. You weren't able to close a case through a workflow or route something to a queue. So now you can do that through workflows by using actions. So there are a lot of actions in here. See all these? And you can create custom actions as well. And then down here are your command actions. So if you wanted to close an opportunity or add item to a queue, add a user to a record team. So these are your access teams if you use that. Qualifying a lead, you weren't able to do that through a workflow in the past. So resolve incident, that's the case. So this has been, pretty useful. So just to show you, if I resolve incident, it automatically pops case in here because that's all you can apply this to is the case entity. And then it allows you to set different properties, which is nice. So, some of these you'll do dynamically based on your workflow, but you can put remarks in, you can put in a resolution, maybe they're typing the resolution on the case itself. You could actually dynamically pull that field and put it in there, billable time, and then you can select the status. Okay. So I'm just going to activate this again, and then I'll show you this in action. Okay. Let's go into my VentureWorks account. Okay, so it's telling me my last appointment date is tomorrow. So it's an upcoming appointment. So I need to call someone and give them 20% off for their birthday. Now, last appointment date, 4/12. Depending on the last appointment I enter, that's going to be my last appointment date. So it's not a true reflection of the last appointment date because this is a future appointment date. This isn't the last appointment date. I want to know the last appointment I had with them, not the next appointment. And if I enter an appointment for next week, save and close, and I'll let that run for a second. Let me refresh my screen. So there is a little flaw in this, right? It's just always going to show me the appointment date of the last appointment entered versus the last appointment date. So we're going to cover that in the next scenario, but for now, go back to our presentation. So what do we learn? So from a child entity, we can access any related parent entity. So that was with the regarding, we could have accessed any of the entities that you can look up in regarding. Any new record can be created via a workflow, even if it isn't related to the entity. So that one step to create record, if I were to add that into my process, I could create any record. I could have created a case, which isn't related to this appointment or account at all. I could have just entered a case and assigned it to some other user in the system. Emails can be sent from a workflow just by adding a step. And fields used in a workflow do not have to be published on the form. And just some best practices surrounding workflows. Workflow steps should have a meaningful text description. Unless there is a true need for a real-time workflow, you want to use a background workflow, especially with the new UI. With the real-time workflows, when the user hits save, the screen kind of whites out, and they have to sit there and wait for the workflow to process before they can access that record again. So if you have a workflow with a lot of conditions, it may only take 15 seconds to run, but that's a long time for a user to sit there looking at a white screen, waiting for a record to save. So unless you have a real need for a real-time workflow, just use a background workflow. Make sure you set your workflow scope accordingly, and always alpha and beta test your workflows, and also, have your users test too. So have, a handful of users test to make sure that you get the results that you want from that workflow. Okay, so our last topic is custom code. So what is it? One of the most common things that custom code allows you to do is to create workflow plugins when standard workflow functionality isn't available. So just some things about custom code. You can write a plugin in any .NET framework, 4.5.2 CLR compliant language. Once you build your class, you can register the DLL file through the plugin registration tool. Capabilities of custom code extend far beyond workflow plugins. However, workflow plugins give end users a familiar interface to interact with and configure the properties and parameters for the plugin to run. So it allows the user to create a workflow and just add a step to the workflow that points to your custom plugin and just set the parameters accordingly. And the Microsoft SDK comes with several plugin samples that you can learn from and build upon. So our business scenario for custom code is the last scenario. If I enter an appointment from the past, or if I update the date on an existing appointment, it doesn't update the account with the last appointment date that I'm expecting. Okay, so let's walk through this. Let me go back to my solution. So I'm going to deactivate this workflow. So we at Behringer, we've created kind of this whole bundle of calculations that you can do through a custom plugin step. And it includes addition, subtraction, multiply, divide, and it has an aggregate function as well. So if you're familiar with calculated and roll-up fields, there are limitations to calculated and roll-up fields, and you can only have so many in your organization. So this aggregate plugin allows you to aggregate data from a related entity up to the parent entity. So I am getting the max start time from the appointment record. And then, so to add this, the same as you would add a regular step, you would just come in here. I would come down to my Behringer custom workflows, and this just gives me a list of all the workflows I have available. So right now I only have add, aggregate, and subtract in here. But like I said, we also have multiply and divide. So it just adds that step, and then there are properties for this. So it's just asking for the field name I want to aggregate, the parent lookup relationship, and then what aggregate function I want to perform. Do I want a sum, average? Do I want the min? Do I want the maximum value? Or do I want to count? And then I can also put a fetch XML filter in here as well. So maybe I have, a huge set of related records and I only want to aggregate the active ones, or I only want to aggregate, a certain condition. So this allows me to set a condition. And this is really easy to get. You just create an advanced find, and if you've never noticed before, on the advanced find window, let me show you real quick. There is an option to download the XML. So I just click on that. It downloads the XML for me. I open that up. Let's just look at it in Notepad. So my query was looking at the current user and the status of active. So if I wanted to aggregate by that, then here is my filter. So this would be my fetch XML filter that I would put into that custom workflow step. Okay, so let me delete this. Okay. So one thing on here, it's pretty much the same. I have my organization when the record's created, when the record field changes, same start time field. And then let me just show you the properties here. The aggregate field name is scheduled start. The parent lookup name is our regarding, because we're basing this on the regarding field. And then the aggregate function I want to perform is max. And I want to do this on all records, so I really don't need to put my fetch XML filter in. Okay. So let me activate this. Let me close this out. So it is getting the max of the appointment. So if I come in here and if I enter an appointment for today, and save it, it's not going to update this date. It's going to leave it as 4/18. So by saying last appointment date, I guess we're looking for the last appointment date that this account has anything scheduled for. So there might be 10 meetings in the next week, but we want to know when the last one is scheduled because we're looking at the maximum date. So I'll just refresh again. I'm sure that it's going to stay the 18th. Okay. And if I look at, do I have business processes in here? Okay. I could look at my background processes. I don't have it in my related menu to see if it was done, but I'm sure it's done. So let's go ahead and add an appointment for after the 18th. 26th. So let's save and close this. Oops. Refresh again. Okay, I'm just going to pop over into the web app because I can see my background processes from there. Waited. It's saying it ran. Let me look here at the workflow. Oh, oh no, oh no. Okay, so it doesn't like my regarding. I think that's because, so one thing that we do here, again, we do a lot of logging so that we can see where it breaks. We log all of our variables throughout the code, and it's saying it doesn't contain a field name with regarding. So I think it's actually regarding ID. So I am gonna check that real quick. I apologize. And let's look here. Oh, it's regarding object ID. So let me go to my process. And that is exactly why we have logging in our custom code of all of our variables. And we also have that try catch statement so that we get a good error message that tells us exactly what went wrong. I'm going to activate this. And that way you don't have to be a programmer to be able to troubleshoot and fix a workflow either. You can just come in to the process sessions, see the failed, go to details, and see the plugin trace here. And we also use what's called the eye tracing service. And I'll talk about this when I cover best practices. But the eye tracing service allows you to see your custom plugin trace log under the plugin trace logs in Dynamics. Now, I don't have this turned on for this demo org, but under system settings, you can decide what logs you want to write here. You can write all logs, you can write failure only, failure and warnings. You get to decide what logs write here, right to this trace log. Okay, so now we should be good. So let's go back into AdventureWorks. And if I add a new appointment for, so just to show you that it does aggregate against all records. Right now, I know my max appointment date's the 26th, but I'm going to enter a record for the 24th. And this should change to the 26th because that is the max date. Okay. So it's saying it succeeded. Maybe I just refreshed too soon. Okay, there we go. So now we're at the 26th. So like I said, it just aggregates all of the appointments because I don't have a fetch XML filter in there. But I could include a fetch XML filter to look at appointments, maybe based on a specific type or based on the status of them. You know, anything that I can do in an advanced find filter, I can add to my aggregate function filter. And just to give you a quick peek at this plugin, so it's the aggregate. We have our inputs and outputs. So this defines those inputs on the parameters, and then we have what comes out. So we get a decimal or a date time value. So you can use this aggregate on date time fields as we did, or you can also use it on decimal or currency fields. And then we just have all our variables. So I talked about that eye tracing service. This is what we use for that. And then these are just all log lines. And this helps us, like I said, this helps us troubleshoot. And then this is where it actually runs through and performs the action. And then just our logging and error handling here at the end. So our exception, the catch. And then once you build your plugin, you register it and you're good to go, and you can access it from the workflow interface. So what did we learn? Custom code can be very powerful. It can fill in gaps that other functionality cannot. Using a plugin is easy since you're just adding it from within the workflow interface that you're already familiar with. And plugins are versatile in that they can be designed to be used across all entities in Dynamic. So that aggregate function I can use across any entity. It's not just specific to the appointment entity. And just some best practices, we use a try-catch. We use regions to help separate our code into sections, so it's just a little bit easier to follow. We log our variables throughout the code to help with troubleshooting that we actually got to see. And we use that eye tracing service. So just to match everything up now, so the first scenario was the business rule. This scenario was a workflow. This was JavaScript, and this was custom code. Okay, so we have about 2 minutes left. If anybody has any questions, if you want to post it in chat, I'll try to get to them. If not, here's my contact information. You can contact us with any questions you may have. And again, you know, our website, we do have blogs on there. We have a lot of blogs that, you know, can just help you with any kind of functionality you work with. Okay. Well, thank you all for attending. I certainly hope that you got something out of this, and I hope to hear from you soon.